If we could all just sit down, please, and we'll try and make a start. I hope you enjoyed the excellent lunch that we all had. But perhaps I could ask you, Dr. Luli? I can't see who that is, who's talking and ignoring us all. But perhaps you could all sit down, please. Anna? Thank you. So it's a great pleasure to be chairing the keynote session on megatrends impacting on fast diseases. My name's James Wood. I'm a member of the STC, so I'm very pleased to take credit for all of the EUFMD's team's organisation for this event, because obviously it's the STC that's done it all, as you've heard, I think, repeatedly. But it's fantastic to be here as part of such a well-organised event. So we have three speakers who are coming at fast diseases in general from a quite different perspective to what we've been hearing about and what we will hear about for much of the rest of this important Open Session 2024. The first speaker, Dr. Dorien Braam, who did her PhD in Cambridge, has a long history of working both with the voluntary non-governmental sector and also with a number of UN and Red Cross agencies around forced migration. And so Dorien is going to be talking about animal and zoonotic disease dynamics in forced migration context. A lot of Dorien's experience has been in South Asia and in the Middle East, and I'm sure that she will give us some insight in some of the challenges that people in forced migrations systems face when trying to migrate with their animals, and what access they do or don't have to animal health resources and so on. So, Dorien Braam.
Thanks very much for the introduction. So my name is Dorien Braam, and in this presentation I will talk a little bit about some of the animal and zoonotic disease dynamics in forced migration and what this means for integrated prevention and control. So climate change and violent conflicts increasingly cause forced migration with direct implications to global animal health. The complex disease dynamics in forced migration are not well understood, however, and the trade-offs involved that remain unclear. This requires an interdisciplinary research approach, not only looking at animal diseases, but involving political and social science approaches to consider the interactions between the causes and impact of forced migration and implications to health. So in this presentation, I'll introduce the concept of forced migration and the links to multi-species health, and introduce an analytical framework that can be used to bridge these concepts between biomedical and social sciences. I will then discuss a series of case study countries which are heavily reliant on livestock for livelihoods, as well as exports. And this includes Jordan, still dealing with the protected humanitarian crisis of Syria conflict, Pakistan, which faces recurring disaster displacements due to changes in land use and climate, and the neglected humanitarian and forced migration crisis that's just going on in Sudan, which is the largest global displacement crisis of our time. I'll end my presentation with describing some of the implications of the research for better integrated multi-level policies and practices. So forced migration is defined by the IOM as a migratory movement which involves force, compulsion, or coercion. The decision to leave a home is therefore not taken lightly and involves a range of push and pull factors, such as the loss of livelihoods, the risk of injury and disease, and often related to a lack of service delivery by state or other actors. Forced migration is a process, and that starts with internal displacements, the movement of people within their country's borders, ultimately leading to people potentially crossing the borders and becoming refugees. In this map that I downloaded last month, it shows the current internal displacement. It is much more than the map that I started this research with about 5 years ago. You can see the people displaced as a result of conflict in the orange parts and the disasters, the blue circles, in 2023 alone. Most displacements are occurring in low and middle income countries where most of the people are dependent on their livestock livelihoods as well. At the same time, as we've heard this morning, most of these countries are also most at risk of emerging animal and zoonotic diseases related to the high dependency on the livestock, the changes in land use, high biodiversity, and impacts of climate change. And this is combined with limited capacity and resources for disease prevention, surveillance, and control. At the same time, the animals and humans most at risk of the negative impact of emergencies are also at highest risk of displacement and disease through historical developments, which forces them to live in vulnerable or marginal environments. And those with fewer resources also lack resilience against disasters, unable to access veterinary or public health services to prevent disease. Complex emergencies themselves are characterized by environmental breakdown, the disintegration of state services, and forced migration, which in turn affects the dynamics and the interactions between humans, domestic animals, and wildlife. Disease risk therefore depends on a range of biological and environmental factors, such as the damage to ecosystems in agriculture, but also the lack of hygiene and crowded living conditions in displaced context, increasing the risk of water and foodborne diseases. So forced migration does not only reduce access to veterinary and medical care, but also veterinary personnel may be displaced themselves, while people are faced with a lack of access to vaccines and infectious disease control as infrastructure collapses. Diseases may spread unnoticed, and the lack of follow-up and self-medication in displacement may also lead to AMR, for instance. Zoonotic diseases are common, but they are often untreated, untested, and may be exacerbated by other chronic diseases, resulting in so-called syndemic epidemics. So lacking clear evidence of the actual animal and zoonotic disease dynamics in forced migration, out of public health concerns, animals are excluded from formal relief and refugee camps in many contexts. Standardized humanitarian responses are primarily developed and led by stakeholders in the global north countries, and often ignoring the central role of animals in people's livelihoods. Where animals are excluded, people instead find their own solutions. For instance, here, these pictures are taken in Somalia in an IDP camp for internally displaced people, and they have used their own resources to improvise shelters for goats and other animals. As a result of the exclusion of animals, people make potentially dangerous trade-offs between health, food security, and livelihoods, whereby households may split up to retain access to animals and lose access to humanitarian services altogether. The underlying mechanisms need to be better understood, as well as the burden of animal and zoonotic disease during displacement. These interlinkages between vulnerabilities and risk requires a systems thinking approach. For instance, the One Health approach, which is defined as an integrated, unifying approach that aims to sustainably balance and optimize the health of humans, animals, and ecosystems. Considering those most vulnerable to disasters are also most at risk of displacement and disease, One Health requires the inclusion of all relevant disciplines and sectors for a comprehensive understanding of the social and structural drivers. In its current form, however, approaches such as One Health often remain largely positivist, focused on biomedical data and solving health challenges, with animal and environmental health often secondary to human health. Resources and capacity are also unequally divided among the different sectoral stakeholders. And as such, my research really focuses on increasing our understanding of the role of animals in complex emergencies and forced migration, and the interacting interspecies health and well-being. My methods include a range of qualitative concepts looking through an analytical framework that is based on existing systems approaches, humanitarian standards, as well as social epidemiological theories, allowing for a more equitable and inclusive approach and interpretation of the multi-level and sectoral factors influencing zoonotic disease vulnerability and risk. And a multi-level and multidisciplinary framework includes, for instance, not only prevalent diseases, but also humanitarian responses, policies, and environmental changes which are relevant to the context. So using this conceptual framework, I conducted case studies with Syrian refugees in Mafra governance in Jordan and disaster-displaced populations in Sindh province. While the Syrian refugee crisis no longer attracts headlines, Jordan still hosts over 620,000 Syrian refugees. Following the outbreak of civil war in March 2011, veterinary services and infrastructure were destroyed, with people losing access to free medication and quarantine facilities for livestock trade, previously a significant contribution to GDP. Many veterinary and health professionals themselves became displaced and subsequently refugees. The Food and Agriculture Organization in 2017 estimated that Syria lost almost half of its livestock since the start of the war due to violence and the lack of feed, with displaced people selling animals to pay for their own food and transportation. Meanwhile, people that were forced to move initially became internally displaced, and those displaced with livestock lost animals due to theft or sold these to pay for onward transportation. Animals sold within Syria by displaced livestock keepers were bought by middlemen and smugglers and ended up in neighboring countries without quarantine and vaccinations, which resulted in an increase of some of the transboundary diseases in the region. Eventually, forced migrants crossed the border into Jordan without their animals, joining relatives or business connections. And the different pathways to becoming a refugee affected their risk and vulnerability to disease. Syrians who already worked in Jordan as migrant workers or conducted livestock export businesses, for instance, were often hosted by their employers and acquaintances, while others were dependent on humanitarian assistance, which by the time of my study had largely dried up. The majority of Syrian refugees live outside the refugee camps and have been there now for over a decade, so they've started rebuilding livestock herds for more sustainable livelihoods, often buying back their animals, unquarantined, unvaccinated, from those smugglers. However, they're also not formally allowed to own commercial herds, so they don't have access to the free vaccination and medication that animals from the Jordanian host populations receive. My second case study investigated animals in disaster displacement in Sindh. So this is a much shorter displacement, internally often only 50 kilometers. However, these communities experience recurring floods due to climate change, but also political economic reasons, for instance, water mismanagement and changes in land use that they have little power over. In 2022, over 8 million people were displaced as a result of the heaviest floods since the super floods in 2010. And these disasters were caused both temporary and permanent displacement, where people rely mainly on historical ties and relatives for relief and transportation. The only movable asset is their animal, following the flooding, they determine their destination location based on the animals that they have. At the same time, they lose many animals due to the disaster, accidents on the road, as well as theft. Destination locations were often determined based on historical pastoral routes and the presence of relatives, who also provided initial humanitarian assistance. The formal response provided little support to animals, which were excluded from formal relief camps. And as a result, those who still owned animals herded these away from the camps, thereby splitting up households, with the men herding the animals, not being able to access humanitarian services anymore. Infectious disease risks were high at both destination and return, and exacerbated by the lack of inclusive policies and facilitation of the animals in displacement. Also, many people used human medication in their animals, which became increasingly expensive during the aftermath of the disaster. The people most at risk of the displacement already lived in the marginalized areas in poor conditions, living closely with their animals, both before and after forced migration, whereas large landowners with political connections control access to land, infrastructure, and services such as education and health. These areas are the first to flood, and people need to bring their livestock to the drier, hilly areas where there's a lack of feed and clean water. And many animals also died from exhaustion during the displacement or picked up infectious diseases from the animals they got in contact with during the move. Upon return, people have to rebuild their homes, and remaining standing water increased the risk of mosquito-borne and other infectious diseases. Those living in a river delta also suffer from sea intrusion due to climate change and salinization as a result of the lack of fresh water. And the lack of feed reduces the immunity of animals and limits production, in turn affecting people and animal nutrition and health. So the findings of these case studies are reflected in the current situation in Sudan, the largest forced migration population ever recorded. This is a result of a neglected governance crisis between two major rival factions of the military government, causing 10 million internally displaced and 1 million refugees in neighboring countries, often residing in overcrowded conditions. While the war disrupted agriculture, many people were already food insecure, and now it culminates in potentially the largest famine that the world has seen in the last 40 years, with 2.5 million people at risk. Meanwhile, bureaucracy hampers the delivery of aid, and hunger is weaponized by both sides, with the World Food Programme estimating they can only reach about 10% of the population. The conflict has exacerbated poverty and food insecurity, which lead to malnutrition, but also co-infections and compromising immune systems. It impaired the healthcare system, reducing access to medical and veterinary facilities and medications. And over 70% of health facilities are now non-functional in conflict-affected areas. And it hampers preventive interventions such as surveillance, diagnosis, and treatment, exacerbating the pre-existing challenges. Sudan is now experiencing multiple disease outbreaks and already historically experienced conflict-driven outbreaks of zoonotic diseases with high case fatality rates, although there is little data, accurate data available due to the volatile situation and the lack of governance. Prior to the war, Sudan ranked among the top 3 African countries in terms of livestock numbers, with an estimated 140 million livestock and the sector providing 40% of employment. Livestock exports remain ongoing, however, without comprehensive animal disease control. Using proxy indicators, such as rising meat prices, empty livestock markets, and pockets of famine, many smallholder farmers are now thought to have lost their livestock. And the conflict has forced people and animals to alter their traditional migration routes in search of new grazing areas, increasingly contact between livestock from different regions, whereas most livestock herds are now owned by merchant soldier cartels, stolen or bought from the desperate herders at low prices, and they monopolize the ongoing lucrative export with the neighboring countries. Besides livestock losses, traditional food sharing mechanisms are broken down, and the resulting nutrition deficit increases the susceptibility for disease. So some of the implications from these case studies show that while biomedical and environmental factors such as changing pathogen and vector environments do play a role in impacting animal health and disease dynamics in forced migration, the actual disease burden and risk is highly dependent on contextual, political, and socioeconomic determinants of health as well, including gaps in humanitarian responses and other structural factors. So while animals and zoonotic disease risk may increase during emergencies, where biological and physiological barriers to disease are removed, more often animal and zoonotic disease are a result of weak and unavailable veterinary healthcare systems. And in Pakistan in particular, displaced animal owners prioritized retaining access to their animals, even where this reduced their ability to relocate or access public services. And so to prevent people putting themselves and their animals at risk of injuries or disease, it is essential that animals are better facilitated in humanitarian responses to forced migration. Maintaining access to animals will improve nutrition, livelihoods, and mental health. And this requires that rather than considering animals as a risk factor for disease, their valuable contribution to human and environmental health and well-being needs to be better considered. A more inclusive, equitable approach to interspecies health and disease during forced migration requires a multi-level, transdisciplinary approach based on local knowledge and capacities and equitable sharing of resources. This requires developing a comprehensive legal framework and social services. Humanitarian responses could involve the provision of animal feed, shelter, and vaccinations, for instance, but also need to look at intersectoral and cross-border collaborations for access to medicines and laboratories where these are destroyed in the disaster. Providing nutrition and shelter to animals will improve their health and well-being, in turn reducing the risk of zoonotic spillover. As monitoring and responding to disease may no longer be possible when veterinary services are incapacitated, it is important to develop national stakeholder networks of veterinary services prior to the emergencies. Alternative solutions need to be developed that work within the context through collaborating with humanitarian responders. And in areas where governments no longer operate and international agencies do not have access, local communities are the first responders to disaster and disease, and is therefore key to support and work together with the community-based organizations and animal health workers, which may require addressing the legal barriers. Trade-offs between health, livelihoods, and welfare across the 3 One Health spheres deserve more careful consideration through bridging biomedical and social sciences. Social sciences can help ensure that veterinary public health responses are equitable and contextualized, and this includes preventing selection bias and underrepresentation of communities versus experts. It also is important to determine variable impacts on population subsamples, establishing robust partnerships with local communities, facilitating collaborative surveillance and the co-creation of sustainable solutions. Thank you very much.
Dr. Braam, many thanks for your fascinating talk. We are under quite a lot of time pressure because of lunch, and I think probably we should deal with questions at the panel stage. So I wonder whether I can invite our next speaker in this a session with 3 speakers and then 4 panel members, because we will be joined on the panel by Dr. Christine Middlemiss, the UK Chief Veterinary Officer, and important member of the EU FMD Executive Committee. Dr. Barroso is a postdoctoral researcher, specializes in wildlife health, ecoepidemiology, and disease management within a One Health framework also. She has a strong background in all of these areas, and has worked widely across Europe, and is going to be talking now about, as you can see, about disentangling the complex interplay between megatrends, biodiversity, and livestock production. Over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation, James. And hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. And today I will be talking on the complex interplay between megatrends, biodiversity, and livestock production. I will follow this structure during my presentation. An ecosystem are a complex scenario where a wide range of wild and domestic animals and humans interact with each other. And pathogens are natural components of these ecosystems, which can infect multiple hosts and spread. And the concept ecosystem includes the set of biological, environmental, and epidemiological components of infection in defined spatial and temporal scales. The epidemiological and ecological connection between pathogen and host are dynamic and depending on the ongoing changing context. And today's own forces are reshaping human relationship, and we must be aware of these forces in order to design effective strategies for risk mitigation. So megatrends in the context of infectious diseases are global forces sustained in the future that will impact infection dynamic. And here is the list that megatrends that could be considered the most important impacting human and animal health. In this figure, you can see changes in human activities from 1980 until now. We are experiencing increases in human population, meat consumption, or livestock health, and a decrease in vegetation cover or biodiversity. All these changes have enhanced the connectivity between humans, wildlife, and livestock, leading to the so-called human-wildlife-livestock interface, with new opportunities for pathogen transmission. Historically, wildlife and humans and the domestic animals were separated, with pathogens circulated at basal levels at each group with seasonal fluctuations, and the holes in the barrier to the spillover were small and did not align. However, with megatrends and changes in land uses, we are increasing the size and the alignment of these holes, leading to increased pathogen risks. This increased connectivity between species increases the risk to exposure to new pathogens, and as interfaces become thinner, pathogens starting to spill over, and some of them gain some transmission potential. Human population has been growing during the last years, and this growth has led to increased demand for food, water, energy, and land. And humans have been forced to modify the environment through several activities, which has altered the landscape structure and the species communities. Among these, the result of these changes is that more 77% of the Earth's land and 87% of the ocean has been altered by human activities. And among these activities, livestock is one of the fastest growing activities in developing countries. The aim is to achieve a more cost-effective production by, for example, increasing stocking rates, which increase transmission risk. And depending on the context, we can see different effects of livestock grazing on the landscape. For example, tropical forests, which are the biologically richest ecosystem in the world, have been impacted by their conversion into farms, into crops or pastures, and it has affected the structure of local ecological communities. And here you have some examples of these human activities impacting livestock. And in the other side of the globe, in developed countries, we have a decrease in rural population and in agropastoral activities, such as livestock farming. And this, together with climate change, lead to a woody plant expansion with a variety of environmental consequences. From positive, allowing the forest regeneration and the recovery of native species, to, in most cases, negative, because we are losing open habitats and key habitats for wildlife, and increasing the likelihood of forest fire or the invasion of alien species. Thus, the outcomes, once again, depend on the local context and the way that the landscape was managed before this abandonment. And during the last decades, also this expansion in the forests and in the shrublands, together with the declining numbers of grazing livestock, the reduced number of hunters because of the society perception, among other causes, the absence of natural predators, some wildlife management practice, such as supplementary feeding, and climate change has led to the overabundance of wild ungulates, which are one of the most important groups for the epidemiology of foot and mouth and other transboundary diseases, by playing different roles from indicator to maintenance hosts or reservoirs, depending on the pathogen and on the local context. And today we live in a super connected reality where animals and products are transported across the globe and where leisure or business travel are part of our daily routines. But the downside of this reality is that we are opening borders to pathogens. As an example of a pathogen facilitated by globalization, African swine fever, the transportation of contaminated products such as meat or food waste transported by air could introduce the virus into disease-free areas. And when live animals are moved to markets where diverse species are in close contact, we are increasing the transmission risk, as in the case of SARS-CoV-1 and 2. And all these changes has also led to a rise in the global temperature, changing rainfall patterns, natural disasters, and ecosystem disruption in general. It has affected the distribution and the behavior of vectors, reservoirs, and pathogens, leading to new outbreaks and emergence of pathogens. And it poses a major threat to global health, as it creates more favorable conditions for pathogens emergence. Here is another example of a pathogen facilitated by climate changes, as the epizootic hemorrhagic disease, which entered Europe in 2022, facilitated by the expansion toward north of the culicoides vectors. And the most important thing is that the effects of megatrends are not isolated. They interact with each other and depend on each other. And it is important to understand the complex interplay between these factors for developing effective risk mitigation strategies, preserving biodiversity, and working toward more resilient systems for public health. Okay, this is an example. I know it's a little conspirational, this study, but open your mind. China has the largest pig herdsite in the world, as we know, with a very intensive breeding system, which allows the African swine fever to spread rapidly, with fatal consequences for the pork industry. And this mass mortality, the higher mortality rates, leads to a shortage in the availability of pork meat, with the subsequent increase in the price. And in this figure, you can see how, as this price increase, also increase the likelihood of human contacting with wildlife infected by SARS-CoV-2 by consuming alternative sources of meat, such as bush meat, which will be acquired at wet markets. It's only an example of this interconnection. And now let me begin to unravel the complex relationship between biodiversity and disease. When a pathogen enters a host community, individuals can show different infection stages, and the home ranges of infected individuals lead to new opportunities for pathogen transmission. And at the metapopulation level, landscape disturbance plays an important role by increasing connectivity between habitat patches and allowing pathogens to spill over. And here, depending on the host community and the biodiversity, could exert an amplification or dilution effect or no effect on the disease risk. The dilution effect is a negative relationship between biodiversity and pathogen richness or prevalence, and it occurs when ecological relationship between species could limit or dilute the pathogen richness. And here, the competent host is an important concept. They are with the spread and generalist species, which are resilient to landscape disturbance, so they could persist as biodiversity is lost in host communities, and therefore, less diverse communities will be more likely to harbor a larger number of these competent hosts. And an example, the Lyme disease, which is the best model to explain the dilution effect. Borrelia burgdorferi has a best host, which is the whitefoot mouse, but can also infect other mammal species. In those communities in which these alternative hosts are abundant, ticks carry less bacteria. However, in those communities in which we have a low biodiversity, the proportion of these competent hosts or reservoirs are higher, and ticks carry more bacteria with the subsequent risks for zoonotic transmission. An amplification effect is the opposite. It's a positive relationship between pathogen richness and species richness, as has been reported, for example, for bovine tuberculosis. And we can also have a no effect for directly transmitted pathogen or specialist pathogens. And once again, it depends on the pathogen, on the host community, and on the context. And now I'm going to tell you about a pilot monitoring project that we have been conducting over the past 4 years with the collaboration of the Spanish Ministry of Agriculture. This study includes a total of 11 pilot monitoring sites, which later expand to 18 across the Iberian Peninsula. And we implemented an integrated wildlife surveillance system in these sites, which include health monitoring by assessing seroprevalence of several pathogens using the wild boar as the indicator species. Also, a population monitoring by assessing the population density of many wildlife species. And also, we developed a social network analysis to understand the indirect interaction between species recorded by camera traps. Here are the results of this social network analysis of each site, but the important result is that we found a negative relationship between pathogen richness and species richness, to suggesting a dilution effect of the biodiversity. But here the most important thing is that some factors related to the host community modulated the pathogen richness. One example is the number of broker species. Broker species in a network are species which serves as a bridge between not directly linked species. And so communities with a higher number of these broker species are communities in which species were less directly linked, and thus potentially reducing the probability of encounters between competent hosts. The clustering coefficient was another parameter negatively related with the pathogen richness, and communities in which clustering coefficient was higher are communities in which species were organized into closed groups, which interact a lot with each other, but rarely interact with the other groups, and thus pathogens face more difficulties to spread in this type of communities, just limiting the pathogen richness also. And also we found a positive relationship between the frequency of interaction between generalist species such as wild boar and rare deer and pathogen richness, suggesting that some imbalance in wildlife management practice could lead to increased pathogen risks. And also we found two main characteristics of the host communities modulating the biodiversity disease relationship. Not only the pathogen richness, but also this relationship between biodiversity and disease. One of them was the centrality of wild boar in the network, which is a measure not only of how many species interact the wild boar, but also with which frequency do it. And in this graph, you can see that in those communities in which wild boar was highly connected to the other species in the black line, the biodiversity could dilute the potential effect of the encounter of this super spreader, of this reservoir, with other competent hosts. However, in those communities in which wild boar was more isolated, we found no effect of biodiversity. And just the risky situation was communities in which wild boar was highly connected to the other species and with a lower biodiversity. And before starting with the effect of livestock, the coexistence between wildlife and livestock entails some positive and negative consequences for both groups, and the outcomes depends once again on some local factors or factors related to the pathogens. And what we see is that in those communities without livestock, with livestock, we found a dilution effect of biodiversity. In this first graph was for the probability of exposure to multiple pathogens. But if we consider the number of circulating pathogens in this second graph, we observe an amplification effect of biodiversity in those communities without livestock. And this is another project of our research group, One Health Farming, which aims to improve the biosecurity of 15 open-air farms. Well, I would like to remark that I'm always talking about open-air livestock farming, not intensive breeding systems. And we aim to improve the biosecurity in those farms and making them more resilient to the emergence of pathogens. And we also found this negative relationship between pathogen richness and species richness. And coming back to our pilot monitoring project, we found a higher biodiversity in those communities with livestock, surprisingly, and this biodiversity increased with the relative abundance of livestock. Always consider that our highest abundance were considered as moderate. We are not evaluating the effect of heavy grazing of herbivory, which I'm sure that will be damage to wildlife. And in the One Health farming project, we observed that most of this biodiversity was located around water sites within the farm. And one possible explanation to this relationship between biodiversity, disease, and wildlife is that in those communities in which livestock were abundant or dominant, we found a less importance of wild ungulates and other generalist species. And also, in communities without livestock, we observe a higher importance of these generalist species, and these generalist species were more connected among each other. And maybe these generalist species may act as competent hosts for many pathogens. It's only one possible explanation. And two main ideas in this complex relationship: outdoor livestock systems contribute to biodiversity conservation by maintaining key habitats for wildlife, which includes lentic water bodies, which are especially relevant in arid and semi-arid ecosystems. And while diverse communities inevitably include species at risk of introducing pathogens, biodiversity in general may limit the circulation of certain pathogens. And coming back to my first lead of megatrends impacting human and animal health, I have selected these three megatrends as the most important for the biodiversity-livestock disease relationship. And for future animal health policies and initiatives, I suggest to focus on ecosystem rather than on a specific host or species, as we know that pathogens circulated in complex systems. There is a clear link between biodiversity, ruminant livestock, and pathogen circulation, which is not linear and depends on the context. So we should promote balanced ecosystems. And I would like to raise a question. Is what might happen if extensive ruminant farming disappears while intensive livestock breeding continues to expand? Well, agricultural abandonment is not the solution, since it's partly contributes to the problem by biodiversity loss in certain areas, eutrophication and land use erosion. It can partly contribute to the solution by creating and maintaining key habitats for wildlife and circular flow nutrients. And keep in mind that 50% of the network Nature 2000 sites are associated with farming activities. Choose sustainable land management with occasional human intervention will be necessary for maintaining this free-ranging farming system. And this is my last slide. The challenge for the future is to design our ecosystem in such a way that we could balance conservation and ecology of wildlife with livestock production and sustain it in the long term. Regulations should be focused on a dynamic prioritization of conservation, and very important, should be adapted to each specific context and each specific ecosystem. On the landscape, most things to do by minimizing the farming impacts on biodiversity. A collaboration in this context are quite relevant, and farmers are the best managers of the biodiversity within the farm. So they should be encouraging for their active involvement in the conservation at the farm level. So thank you very much.
Dr. Barroso, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. I think, like as for the first talk in this session, we will need to move on to the next and deal with questions afterwards, but thank you very much indeed. The third speaker and final keynote in this session, Mehroosh, if you want to come up, Dr. Mehroosh Tak, who is a senior lecturer in agribusiness at the Royal Veterinary College in London. Dr. Tak is a card-carrying economist, and as I think many of you will be aware, there aren't enough of these working in agriculture globally. And she's got particular interests in financialization of livestock genetics markets and so on, and is also the principal investigator on a UK scheme, the Critical Research on Industrial Livestock Systems. I think that I'm going to hand straight over and let Dr. Tak talk about rethinking policymaking for fast diseases in an economic context. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James, and thanks very much to the EU FMD team for this invitation. If I can figure out how to use this mic while also looking at my notes, it'd be great. Okay, I'm going to check if this is working. Brilliant. Let me start today's presentation by taking a food systems lens. In 2023, the FAO's COAG on Subcommittee of Livestock released a report highlighting the importance of animal source foods for nutrition. This is especially true for the global south, where the burden of malnutrition is quite high. Whilst the livestock revolution has drastically improved the availability of terrestrial animal source foods around the world since 1960s, as you can see in this graph, it has also increased the burden of disease. As reduction in feed conversion ratios and yield advancements and growth in the sector are celebrated, the inequalities in animal source food consumption continue to exist. This graph specifically shows how the supply of animal source foods in Asia and Africa are far less than the supply in the global north. As the sector progresses and improves, this progress is not universal. I start with this context of food consumption and production because to tackle fast diseases, we as researchers need to remind ourselves what is the purpose of focusing on fast diseases. There is a general acknowledgement of the fact that we need to balance increased yield productivity with nutritional and livelihood goals. But for fast disease control, minimizing habitat disruption and safeguarding global food supply should be a key priority for governments and international organizations. But instead, we tend to focus the debate very much on trade and the risk of disease spread with limited attention that is paid to the context in which these diseases occur. Although I have to say the previous two speakers have paid some attention to that. But overall, in the general context, we don't spend much time doing that. So rethinking how to create these policies is critical to identifying solutions for fast diseases. And in this presentation, I want to shed light on the new structure of livestock production systems and its implications for fast diseases, and thus making a case for aspects of policy making and evidence generation that need a rehaul. I will highlight 3 aspects of policy making that require embracing new methods from disciplines that are usually not mainstreamed in disease research. Although some social scientists have been talking about this for many decades now, they've been talking about this for a while, but I hope that by the end of this presentation, I'll leave you with an appreciation, specifically, I mean, in general for social science, but specifically for political economy research and understanding how fast diseases can be dealt with. So let me begin with further ado. I have to say the previous speakers asked us a question: what happens if we move in, if all of the livestock is produced in like intensive farming systems? The truth of the matter is majority of the animal source foods that are produced in the world are produced in intensive farming systems at the moment. Specifically, they are produced in corporatized systems, which can be characterized by high levels of vertical and horizontal integration, concentrated markets, and financialization of the industry, which means, in practical terms, that transnational corporations now dominate national and international markets through integrated management of animal genetics, specifying and matching meat quality for international markets, developing, sourcing, supplying animal feed, stipulating medicine and vaccines, organizing grow-out conditions, orchestrating slaughter and processing, and managing product lines and marketing. While corporatization has benefits, specifically has economies of scale, it often is assumed that industrialization is consistent with lower disease risk, as few firms exert greater control over the market. They improve biosecurity in terms of reduced incursion of pathogens and internal segmentation of livestock. Yet, the combined effects of livestock production expansion due to the increase of corporatization, environmental degradation, deteriorating labor practices, animal movements have implications for fast disease risks. Beyond the obvious debates around disease risk related to intensification of production, corporatization has economic and financial system consequences also that have changed the structure and the way we produce animal source foods. As you can see in this figure, only a few companies own genetics for pig and cattle. The picture is very similar for other clone-footed ruminants. And it's worth noting that this picture is from 2007, so there's been more concentration in the market. Specifically, I know we're not talking about poultry here today, but for poultry, broiler, only 2 companies own genetics in the world, and for layer, and one more additional firm owns genetics. And this slide, particularly, adds another layer of information on who really owns livestock production systems at the moment. Common ownership, which is also known as horizontal shareholding, whereby a handful of asset managers or private equity firms invest in multiple companies in the same sector. So you can see over here, Vanguard and, say, for example, Vanguard and BlackRock have investments in nearly all large meat, dairy, feed firms in the world. This is due to increased financialization of livestock systems, and that is shifting power in the hands of banks, asset managers, and large-scale institutional investors rather than the scientists that are sitting in this room. The key implication of increased common ownership is the rise of anti-competitive behavior. This is because there's very little incentive for large shareholders of firms to push management to push management to increase their own market share via price competition or innovation. Rather, common owners have an incentive to encourage firms to undertake strategies that assist the whole sector, a form of passive cartelization. This growth of passive investment strategies, where a few asset management firms invest in livestock production, means there's very little incentive for firms to innovate. This is similar behavior as we've seen in poor investment for new antibiotics, and that is a key problem for AMR management globally. Further proliferation of private standards can have trade limiting and market distorting effects, affecting the ability of countries to be able to earn from trade. And corporate concentration also limits the role of smallholders in livestock production. In this financial context, I want to situate the three aspects of policymaking that need changing, or a rethink, as I say. First and foremost, we need to rethink the way fast control measures are envisioned. Fast control measures are often linked with productivity loss and economic costs. This thinking is based on the dominant narrative that international trade is a key contributor to economic growth. However, evidence suggests that economic growth does not automatically lead to poverty reduction or to improved nutrition or even for a country's capacity to be able to control diseases. Increased productivity needs to be linked with food safety and environmental sustainability at macro level, but also livelihood and nutrition at a micro level. The question of livelihood arises as increasing corporatized production systems shift away from smallholder to large-scale integrated producers. It is thus pertinent to ask what is the role of smallholders in managing diseases, but also what is the role of livestock systems in reducing poverty and malnutrition. So there's new research that my team has been doing in India has found that increased availability of animal source food does not automatically lead to improved nutrition for all or improved poverty for all. Corporatization of animal source food production has the ability to improve food safety and also better disease management, but it also leads to product segregation. And that creates winners and losers, where the winners who already have access to good food or safe food will continue to have that, but those who have limited access to nutritious foods are the ones who buy cheap and unsafe food. And control measures also require a gendered lens, as evidence suggests that intra-household disparities exist in relation to animal source food consumption. If the aim of livestock production system is to increase availability of animal source foods, to improve nutrition, and to create affordable animal source foods, we need to ask whether increased trade will improve nutrition for all. The existing evidence on this relationship suggests this relationship is not linear at all. Thus, rethinking fast control measures need to be integrated with nutrition and livelihood with a gendered lens. The second aspect of rethinking policymaking is rethinking investments, and it's obvious that the need to control disease requires a clear boost of investment both from the state and the private sector. However, there's a fundamental need to carefully analyze who is investing and where is the investment going. In 2023, the public development banks, so the world banks of the world, invested about $3.3 billion US dollars in industrial livestock production systems, specifically targeting intensive production systems in low and middle income countries, and not developing infrastructure to support disease control, surveillance, diagnostics, or regulatory enforcement capacity. Of this $3.3 billion, $1.5 billion was spent just by the World Bank Group, including the International Finance Corporation. And all of these investments particularly supported intensive farming systems that promote further financialization and consolidation of the livestock production system, as I've shared in my previous slides. The final rethinking is how we frame policymaking and technical debates. And in fast disease control agenda is usually just grounded in the need for safe trade that generates economic value. This agenda, founded on area-based disease freedom and strict separation of commercial export-oriented herds from others, is rooted in a strong science and policy agenda that is laid out by international organizations and commercial interests that have deep historical imperial roots. These colonial roots have created assumptions that are difficult to undo, and assumptions that sway national debates on fast disease control measures, sometimes blocking alternative views and perspectives such as one-size-fits-all approach still continues to decide how policy is made. We need to reckon with the historical implications of economic liberalization policies, especially the structural adjustment programs and the poverty reduction strategy papers that played a key role in reducing veterinary capacity in many low and middle income countries. Thus, limiting government capacity for surveillance and disease control needs to reflect on how The evidence on World Bank structural adjustment programs have diluted the ability of African governments specifically to support livestock producers as we continue to blame limited state capacity for poor disease outcomes. Without acknowledging how and why we got here, the policymaking community will be unable to create any sustainable solutions to fast disease control. Thus, a decolonization of policy debate away from international trade towards a better understanding of structural drivers of fast diseases is required. And by decolonization, I broadly mean and refer to the reversing of structures of colonization and allowing countries to take control of the narrative and empower their indigenous citizenry. In the context of animal health, it can be seen as donor groups ensuring the recipient countries are provided with resources and supports to develop and drive their own culturally relevant interventions, rather than having these driven by global north researchers or structures and private sector organizations under the guise of standardization, trade regulation, and rules. As the modes of production of terrestrial animal source foods change from extensive and smallholder produced to intensive farming-backed integrated corporatization and financialization, the consequences of the new economic and financial structures have on productivity and food safety and quality market structure need an assessment. The view from molecular biology, epidemiology, mathematics, and other bioscience-related disciplines is crucial in creating a true assessment of past and future disease risks. However, as I've argued today, with changing production landscape and that are entrenched in complex financial structures, the classical view that trade equates to livelihood improvements or technological fixes will manage disease is now an orthodox view. Social science methodologies invoke new questions that allow for in-depth understanding of fast control practices and the ability to ground those practices within locally relevant cultural, economic, and political realities is crucial to any assessment of how FMD and other transboundary diseases can be managed. We need to ask different questions that challenge and critique current industrialized structures. And at the Royal Veterinary College, we're asking some of those questions through the project called CRILS, which stands for Critical Research in Industrial Livestock Systems. Through this project, we're trying to nuance the narratives around dominant livestock production systems. We want to strengthen pathways to action through research translation and build links between academia and non-academic partners, including the industry, civil society organizations, and think tanks. If you'd like to know more about the project, you can go to the website, but also come have a chat with me, and so we can explore how your research can leverage from social science or political economy questions in particular. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mehroosh, very much for that really fascinating talk. And if I can invite Dr. Middlemiss and the other three speakers to join me on the stage here. And I was going to start off by kicking off with a broad question to try and bring Christine into the discussion in the context of the presentations that we've just heard. And if I can take a fairly European perspective on this first with this question, think about Dr. Middlemiss's responsibilities as a chief veterinary officer in Europe. I think we've heard from all three presenters the challenging trends that are coming around biodiversity loss, around massively increased forced migration of people, often with their animals. And Mehroosh's talk just now, which I think clearly identifies some of the, let's say, missed opportunities perhaps in development at the moment, where there's investment in livestock development, but not on livestock health to run alongside it. I want to ask Christine how you think, within the European context, you perhaps would like to, what would be the optimal way of responding to these sorts of threats, not in the short term, but in the kind of longer term changes that you might want to drive? Or maybe come to the other panelists to consider that as well.
Gosh, that's an enormous question. I feel like got to have a big pot of solutions. I think there's two key things underpinning for me. One, and we heard from Dorien about social behaviour and what drives people to do what they do, how they live with their animals and move them. And we're getting better at looking and understanding that, but we need to do way much more than that, because that's what creates the risk pathways for us that we then have to act on. And some of it is financial drivers, and I think we have quite a difficult conversation at the moment, certainly we see in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, whereas to preserve biodiversity, reduce environmental impact, the role of the farmer who is running a business, who we're asking him to run his business potentially in a different way to have less impact on areas that we as society care about. But he needs an income too, and how we pay for that, whilst we still want to have relatively cheap food in the supermarket. And we've been round in the UK thinking about having a food strategy. We have a farming strategy. How you bring all that together when you're culturally diverse, your geography is diverse, and therefore that affects all your disease risk pathways. So I would like to see much more integration of those of us doing disease control with social behaviour scientists and bringing those together. I think that's absolutely critical. There's a real balance and about doing it at regional level, community level, as we heard, national level, and then global level. I don't think we do think enough about those big international companies who are operating in different national regulated systems and how we drive their behaviours and how they balance the market then drives our own behaviours. And there's a bit of a virtuous circle there. And I think that is something, again, that we should much better understand, but I accept and acknowledge it will be really, really difficult. But on a positive note, we're having the conversations. You know, there was the WOA Horizon report for the centenary. We're having a conversation here. They're really difficult and challenging conversations, but we are having them, so that's got to be a good place.
Christine, thank you. Dorien, do you want to add to that?
Yes, thanks. Yeah, just to add to that, because what I found, it's not just the behavior of people that is important to look at, but also why they behave like this. So going to the structural drivers, and I think Mehroosh was really nicely touched upon that. So for instance, in Pakistan, what you find is that people live in marginalized environments. This has a lot to do with the colonialized or institutionalized colonization and what the sort of agriculture schemes that have been put in by international finance organizations. So it's really why are people behaving like this, and how does that need to be addressed? They don't choose to live in those environments. They're really forced to by external factors that are much bigger than responding to disease.
Yes, I think that we should incentivize the active involvement of farmers and collaborate with them, maybe facilitate more than instead of being subjected to restricted regulations or something like this. But I think it's one of the most important things is to share our scientific knowledge with them. To try to be involved in all this progress.
Can I add something else about that? So I get about incentivizing farmers. It's very scary for them. Many of them have farmed for generations, and it is what they know as their life. And so to take them on the journey of doing things differently and what it means for their livelihoods and their family and their community is a really difficult conversation. We've got to have it, yes, but it's really...
I totally agree.
There's other drivers for them behind... I talked about being a business, but there's lots of social factors behind why people farm and have livestock.
Are there any questions from the floor? I've got several here as well. I don't see any hands up. So maybe I'll ask the next one, and while we're addressing that, please do put your hand up, and I'd be really interested to hear some of your concerns around this broad space. I want to build on the discussion that we've just had. I think we understand the way that climate change and biodiversity loss are impacting things like the risk of disease emergence and actually livestock production and health as well. But actually, I think one of the things that while we're thinking a lot in the UK, and I think also across Europe, there are policies being increasingly put in place to try and prevent further biodiversity loss and actually aid nature recovery. I think the big challenge here is how we can do these things which are a societal good at the same time as sustaining effective livestock, effective food systems. Obviously, in the context of this conference, we're talking about livestock systems, but also thinking about making sure that those are not just productive, but also resilient to fast diseases. And I don't know whether I can turn to you first and ask, because you've been talking and thinking a lot about biodiversity, whether you can try and bring in the context of food and lower disease risk.
Yes, I know it's very difficult to balance livestock production with wildlife conservation, but maybe we should, I don't know, reduce our main idea of meat consumption, or not sure about how to manage it, but we should work towards more sustainable agroecosystems and maybe working towards this type of livestock production, and how to include biodiversity in all of these, maybe by little actions such as rotational pastures or including more water holes in a farm. Not only is a concept of reduce the stocking rates, but also with small actions that could improve the biodiversity.
Chris, do you want to add that? Or should
It's
a tough one.
It is. I think there's actually a big role for vets and trusted advisors at farm level here, working with farmers to understand their land, how they're operating, what can be done better, differently. Some easy wins sometimes that they don't take up a huge amount of time. They may actually save you time, invest to save, and actually will have benefits in terms of antimicrobial use, greenhouse gases, that if you get more and more people doing them, then contribute to reducing waste. And so increasing production for me is not about making more, it's about having less inputs to get the same quality product.
Is this on? Yeah. Just to add to that, at a macro level, I think countries need to decide what's the triangle of like more production, livelihoods, and consumption and nutrition, even in the UK, where increasing obesity is linked to red meat consumption. Do we really need to be producing more to consume, or are we producing more to create more profit or more income generation over here? But for whom? So I think at a macro level, trying to see, okay, if we want to focus on climate change in the UK, but we're going to import food from outside, who are we outsourcing our greenhouse gas emission to versus do we even need to produce that much more? I think those are very tough questions. They're obviously not straight answers to that, and a lot of consultation and collaboration is required between the citizens, the governments, and the private sector, and at a global level, not just a country level, because classic problem of prisoner's dilemma. Do we do this first versus someone else does it first? So that's where economics comes in, by the way.
But that made me think about a cultural aspect to this. So in the UK, the way dietary habits have developed, there'll be bits of carcass that our consumers wouldn't eat and wouldn't pay for, and are waste in the UK. But for other cultures, that is valued, and so you export it, and you get income for that, but actually that's reducing your costs overall. So there's a real tension there about how you do that. Make it, for me, it comes back to what I said about how you make most value and use all bits of what you're producing with the lowest inputs.
Yeah, while we're thinking about the next question, I want to add a note of optimism here. I spent the weekend on a farm in the east of England where this farm actually is the centre of our, I don't want to be nice about DEFRA while Christine's here, but actually this is, we have a series of nature recovery grants being coming from our Department of Agriculture, DEFRA. This is the largest scheme in terms of area of land impacted, and actually they are measuring amazing biodiversity reclamation alongside effective. This is a beef and cattle, a beef and lamb farm, alongside economic production of food. Just by the very simple measure of doing a few things to reclaim biodiversity, but one of the most, the simplest ones is by introducing cultivated margins with mixed crops down the edge of each field, which are cropped at different times of the year and have restrictions around this. And they've seen, in some cases, along with some of the vagaries of the very interesting part of the countryside, the sandy part of the countryside they live in, a 60-fold increase in biodiversity in some specific spots just by some of the measures that they've introduced. So I think sometimes we think this is almost impossible, but I think that there are instances where biodiversity recovery can be delivered alongside commercial farming if it's done carefully enough. But I think the challenge is, as we've just discussed, getting farmers to accept and see that they can do this alongside some more traditional practices as well in a way that doesn't necessarily force them out of business, although probably they need some incentives, as indeed this farm has received, or this network of farms have received, in order to get them to start with those measures. But I think this is really important for sustainable livestock production, which we obviously all need to remain in jobs, I think. So there is a question back there. And there's a lady in white. If you put up your hand again, then Nadia may bring you a microphone. I can't see who it is. Oh, yeah, okay.
Thank you. I want to congratulate all the speakers for these excellent presentations. And you know, mine is, I don't know whether it's a question or not. It's related to biodiversity. So in the global biodiversity framework, one of the indicators relates, it's called the Aichi Target 9, and it relates to the prevention and control of invasive alien species. So identifying the pathways to introduction and spread for control of priority species and even eradication of priority species. And it measures what countries are doing to manage those pathways to prevent introduction and spread of invasive alien species or pests and diseases. And I think that's an area where you can link fast disease control and biodiversity targets. And countries clearly haven't thought about it. They're not reporting enough on it. I'm not sure many countries are. And I just wanted to ask all of you that, have you sort of considered that within this overall sphere of expanding the conversation to going beyond just controlling fast diseases for trade?
Thank you.
So I'll start. I was lucky enough to work in Australia for a while before I took this role on. And for me, compared to UK, potentially Europe, they are much more aware of the biodiversity impact and are quite focused on it, but integrated, absolutely integrated as part of biosecurity. So their newest biosecurity legislation covers animal pathogens, plant pests, and non-native invasive species. And in the UK experience, traditionally our reasons for acting on disease were about trade, public health, animal welfare, but not actually the environment and biodiversity. We're getting smarter at that. It requires collaboration and bringing different, in effect, silos, different policy thinkers together to understand the benefits and see that there is a commonality of benefit there that we want to achieve. So I think we've got a lot more to do, but there are countries that are further down this road, and I think there will be scope to improvement, but are taking greater steps.
Thanks, Chris. And Dr. Barroso.
Yes, I would say that this is the reason why we are implementing this integrated wildlife monitoring system that not only consider the numerator data, the target or passive surveillance, but also population monitoring. And by camera traps, we can also detect these invasive alien species. And in fact, we have done it with some species in Spain. So I think it's the main reason why we are working towards integrated wildlife surveillance systems.
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting question.
So a massive plug for integrated wildlife surveillance, internationally integrated wildlife surveillance.
And harmonized.
Because in that One Health sphere, that's where we understand many of the risks are coming, and we need to understand those better, but there needs to be confidence about how that data is used, that there isn't then penalties for people.
Yeah, there's a question. Nigel. He's trying to stop me asking my last one.
I'll keep it brief then. Fascinated by the case studies of humanitarian disasters and how they impact on people and the role of livestock in both how that unfolds, how the problems unfold, and then the potential for recovery. It suggests that there's a need for a One Health approach in response to crises. And do you think there's a prospect that that might happen? And do you think that there are different ways of doing things that might make an approach to animals and the people that own them more effective in the future in terms of both the immediate response and possibly the long-term recovery? Thank you.
Thanks. That's a very large question, a lot of different answer strands. But I guess what I would want to focus on the basis of the presentation, like it is so contextual how people, what they do with their animals, how they move, and how this impacts health. So I think the basis of obviously it needs a One Health approach, because we're not just talking about animal health, we're talking about livelihoods, about how they rebuild their lives, how they resettle if they return at all. But it requires a social science approach to find out those drivers. Why do people move with their animals, or why do they decide to sell, for instance? I think there is momentum after COVID, now that One Health is sort of globally well known, whether it's the perfect approach, but it's a good systems approach. And there are research agendas being developed at all quadripartite organizations. They're right now they're being developed at global level, and they're reaching out to regional and national level as well. So I think there's definitely scope in the coming years to feed into those agendas.
James?
Thanks, sorry. Yeah, Mehroosh, please.
Sorry, did I cut you?
No, go on.
Just to kind of add to that point, I think Dorien's presentation really nicely explained two different examples of humanitarian situations. One, where you need a short-term first responder situation response, like, for example, in Sudan, although some would say Sudan is now a protracted crisis, and the second is a protracted crisis like Syria, where over a decade has passed and the crisis continues in many ways. In the second scenario, in protracted crisis, where there is no state capacity or governance capacity, and the only capacity to respond to any crisis for animals are communities themselves, there is no surveillance, there's no diagnostics, there's no data collection that is happening. And I think that's where the crisis community or the conflict community really needs to be spending more efforts on understanding what can we do there. We have some understanding of how to deal with humanitarian crisis, although those responses don't always work because of multiple different reasons, and we don't need to go into them right now. But in the protracted crisis sphere has very little work, theoretical thinking or applied thinking done on And if people here are working in that community, I would recommend like kind of take something from Dorien's presentation today to reflect on.
Thank you. I just want to round up with ask all of the panelists to respond, and I want to put this in the context of we've broadened our discussion way beyond a lot of things that are normally discussed at the open session, which I think has been fantastic. But bring things back to what animal health policy changes should be made within the European context, considering the emerging threats that we've been talking about and we've heard a lot around this morning in the Straight FMD and other sessions today. What intersectoral collaborative approaches should be taken to change policies to mitigate these risks, given the current animal health challenges? And Christine, we could either ask you to go first or last on this one.
Last. I appreciate hearing the views of broader views of others, and I can bring it back.
There are many different approaches from socioeconomic relating to biodiversity and so on, reducing some of these challenges. But Mehroosh, I wonder whether we could start with you to respond to this. I mean, you talked. I was struck by your characterization of the huge, the very small ownership of massive agribusinesses and so on, whether there are intersectoral things that we should be doing around that space in order to mitigate risks of animal diseases for Europe.
I'm going to answer this question very much as an academic and what we need to do in terms of training and capacity of researchers and policymakers rather than... So I'll indirectly answer your question.
That's the best you can do, I think. It's impossible. Yeah.
And I guess the focus... my job and my skill sets really allow me to think about macro level questions and link them to micro trends and in terms of like human behavior and like behaviors of like say firms for in this context and asking those like making those linkages between aggregate demand and aggregate supply, I think very critical. And so moving away or asking additional questions that are not based within just risk assessment, I think is critical to be able to respond to some of these crises. If you have social scientists in your team or in your college or your university or your risk centers, go speak to them and try to get their perspective on the question that you are trying to answer and see if that provokes any kind of interesting questions for you to, or different approaches for you to continue doing the work that you're already doing.
Thank you. It wasn't meant to be an easy question, by the way. Yeah.
Yes, I think that we need collaboration among different sectors, and also, once again, to improve biosecurity, maybe at the farm levels. Also, good and standardized system for wildlife surveillance, integrated wildlife surveillance, and to work towards the balanced agroecosystem once again. But I know it's a difficult challenge.
Thank you.
I would actually want to come back to something that Mehroosh said in her presentation. I think for the EU region, with our resources, with our knowledge, and obviously we've heard this morning that the laboratories and the systems here are so strong, we need to share those resources, and we need to localize resources and policies and get more knowledge of the local context to feed into the high-level policies that we develop here in Europe and in the US.
Thank you.
So I think for me, I found this question really hard because often because of politics and I mean just the timeliness, the systems, the way the drivers work, and short-termism potentially, trying to look ahead and have policies that impact way down the line can be quite difficult. But I think the thing that is most successful and helps that is it's collaboration, but it's co-design with industry, farmers, the people who are going to be impacted, because we've heard about the global businesses, we've talked about individual farmers. You can't sit, a good example actually, many of us, a number of us here were at an HPI conversation held by WOA, run by IABS last week in Paris, talking about HPI and vaccination, where we had industry and we had government, and pharma companies coming together to discuss and understand what the problems were and how the solutions might work. And I think that has to be one of the most, we need to be brave and do more and find time to do more of that.
Thank you to all of the panelists. I hope you found the discussion that we've had this afternoon absolutely fascinating, as fascinating as I have. I think it's been a brilliant discussion. Please join me in thanking all four of them very much for their time this afternoon. So there is a tea and coffee break now, which is served in the reading room, the coffee room. It was due to be till 4 o'clock, so you don't have much time. 7 minutes. Nadia, how long? When do we want people to come back? Should we say at 15:15? So that's over 20 minutes. So please, can you make a real effort? I know we've got to catch up a bit of time. Please come back by 15 minutes, even if you're still in the queue for tea and you're feeling frustrated and thirsty. And remember to look at the posters, because they're absolutely wonderful and they're brilliantly presented. Thank you.